What was it like to live through the 1300s? What could steal your breath away when you were already past your prime? How did people face their final moments in a world so different from our own, between the years of 1000 and 1500? Number 5. Environmental extremes and exposure. The medieval world was often a brutal master, demanding constant negotiation with the very elements that sustained life. For older people, those who had already weathered decades of hardship, the environment itself could deliver a fatal blow. Often quietly and insidiously, without the drama of a battle or the clear symptoms of a swift plague, their bodies already worn by years of labor, illness, and meager diets possessed a diminished capacity to withstand the harsh realities of nature. One of the most relentless threats was the biting cold of winter. Homes, even for the relatively well-off, were rarely sealed against the elements. Peasant cottages often featured single rooms shared by families, and sometimes their animals heated by a central hearth that often allowed as much smoke out through a hole in the roof as it kept warmth within. Drafts were a constant companion, seeping through gaps in wattle and daub walls, beneath ill-fitting wooden doors, and through unglazed window openings. For an older person, whose circulation might already be flagging, and whose body fat reserves were likely meager, this pervasive cold could lead to hypothermia, a condition where the body loses heat faster than it can produce it. A chronicler from the monastery of St. Albans in England described a particularly severe winter in the early 14th century, where rivers froze solid enough to bear the weight of carts for weeks on end, and even birds reportedly fell from the sky frozen mid-flight. For those who had passed their younger years, simply going about daily chores, tending to a small patch of garden, or fetching water from a frozen well, could be enough to bring on the fatal chill. Their fingers and toes would grow numb, their movements would slow, and a profound weariness, often mistaken for mere old age, would creep in, leading to a quiet, cold death in a cold dwelling. Beyond the immediate threat of hypothermia, prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions fostered a host of secondary issues that could prove lethal for older individuals: rheumatism and arthritis. Common afflictions for those engaged in physical labor throughout their lives would be exacerbated by the persistent, chill-making movement, agonizing and limiting self-care. Persistent dampness in homes, often from poor drainage or leaks, contributed to a general state of ill health. The very air within their dwellings, thick with smoke from the hearth and the accumulated odors of unwashed bodies and animals, became a breeding ground for respiratory illnesses. Older lungs already compromised by previous infections or decades of breathing smoky air were particularly vulnerable. Bronchitis could easily escalate into pneumonia, a deadly killer in any age, but especially so when there were no effective medicines beyond herbal poultices and hopeful prayers. The English physician, John of Gaddesden, writing in the early 14th century, documented cases of chest sickness prevalent in winter months, often carrying off the elderly and infirm. Farming life, the backbone of medieval society, exposed older people to a unique set of environmental hazards. Even if they were no longer performing the heaviest labor, they still participated in sowing, harvesting, and animal care. Sudden violent storms could trap them far from shelter. A summer thunderstorm could bring flash floods to low-lying areas, sweeping away the frail, heavy rains turned paths into treacherous mud, making falls common. And for an older person, a simple broken bone could quickly become a death sentence due to infection or the long, debilitating recovery period. The scorching heat of summer, particularly during prolonged droughts, presented another kind of danger. While less common in temperate Europe than intense cold heat waves could lead to dehydration and heat stroke, especially for those tending fields or animals under the relentless sun. The body's ability to regulate temperature naturally diminishes with age, Medieval people had no understanding of electrolytes or rehydration therapy. A prolonged fever brought on by heat stroke could easily lead to organ failure. Records from the monastic annals often mention years of great drought and burning sun, alongside descriptions of widespread illness and death, not just from famine but from the direct impact of the heat on weakened populations. The landscape itself, untamed in many areas, presented direct environmental risks. Forests were vast and often dense, holding dangers beyond just human bandits. Wild animals driven by hunger occasionally attacked isolated settlements or individuals venturing too far from their communities. A wolf pack, desperate for food in a harsh winter, might not distinguish between a plump sheep and a frail old woman struggling through the snow. Such attacks, while statistically rare, were deeply feared and could lead to gruesome, fatal injuries. Bogs and marshlands, often traversed for shortcuts or to gather reeds, posed hidden perils. An older person, perhaps with failing eyesight or less steady footing, could easily lose their way or fall into a treacherous bog, succumbing to exposure or drowning. Furthermore, the very methods of daily survival created environmental hazards within the domestic sphere. Open fires, while essential for warmth and cooking, were a constant source of danger. Sparks could ignite flammable thatch roofs, leading to devastating house fires that could trap the less mobile, elderly within. The smoke itself, perpetually present, led to chronic respiratory problems. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires was also a silent killer, especially in sealed-up dwellings during winter nights. A family might wake to find an older relative, perhaps suffering from a chronic cough, simply not stirring their death attributed to a sudden unknown illness, when it was, in fact, the unseen gas. Wells, though vital for water, could collapse, or an older person could fall in, especially during periods of darkness or poor visibility. The absence of modern safety standards meant that every aspect of daily life, from drawing water to simply staying warm, carried an inherent environmental risk that disproportionately affected those whose physical resilience had waned. The sheer unpredictability of medieval weather patterns, magnified by what is now understood as the Little Ice Age, starting in the 14th century, meant that communities could be plunged into extreme conditions with little warning or preparation. Late frosts could destroy nascent crops, leading to famine, but also subjecting older, vulnerable populations to prolonged periods of bitter cold without adequate food or fuel. Conversely, torrential rains could lead to widespread flooding, not only destroying crops but also making roads impassable, isolating villages, and forcing people to live in damp, unsanitary conditions. The English monk, John of Worcester, described the catastrophic floods of 1099, which inundated fields and swept away homes, leaving many destitute and exposed. For the elderly, these natural disasters were often the final straw, their bodies simply unable to withstand the cumulative stress of displacement, exposure, and the subsequent lack of sustenance or shelter. Their long lives, a testament to their endurance, often ended not with a sudden illness but with the quiet, relentless pressure of the environment itself. Number 4. Violence and warfare. Life in the medieval period was often punctuated by bursts of extreme violence, a stark and sudden contrast to the grinding struggle of daily existence. For older people, those who had seen many years and perhaps believed their days of direct conflict were behind them, violence could arrive unannounced, brutal, and utterly final. It was not just the grand battles between kings and armies that posed a threat, but the ever-present danger of localized raids, banditry, and the harsh realities of medieval justice. Warfare, even if seemingly distant, had a profound and deadly impact on older populations, while younger men typically comprised the fighting forces. The devastating effects of conflict spread far beyond the battlefield. When armies marched through a territory, whether friendly or hostile, they often lived off the land, This meant the systematic pillaging of villages and farms. Soldiers would seize livestock, grain stores, and any valuables they could find. For older people, who might have spent their entire lives accumulating a small store of food or a few precious possessions, this destruction of their livelihood was catastrophic. A chronicle from 13th century France describes the widespread devastation wrought by roving bands of soldiers during the Albigensian Crusade, where entire regions were stripped bare. Older inhabitants, often too frail to flee, were left behind with nothing. The subsequent starvation or exposure, brought on by the loss of their food and shelter, would quickly claim their lives. The destruction of homes, the burning of crops, and the slaughter of animals meant an immediate and often unsurvivable loss of all means of existence for the elderly who depended on their accumulated resources and the stability of their community. The sieges of towns and castles were particularly harrowing experiences for everyone within the walls, including the elderly. When a siege began, food and water supplies would be rationed, and sanitation would inevitably deteriorate. The constant threat of bombardment from catapults or trebuchets, the terror of a breaching wall, and the gnawing hunger and thirst would take a severe toll. Older people, with their reduced physical reserves, were often the first to succumb to starvation or disease within besieged fortifications. Accounts from the Siege of Calais in the mid-14th century during the 100 Years' War detail how the inhabitants were reduced to eating rats and other scavenged food. For those advanced in years, this extreme deprivation led to rapid decline and death. If the town eventually fell, the ensuing sack was a nightmare. Soldiers, fueled by anger and lust for plunder, rarely showed mercy. Older men and women, unable to resist or flee, were vulnerable to direct violence, assault, or simply being trampled in the chaos. The chronicler Jean Froissart vividly describes the brutality of such events, where age offered little protection. Beyond formal warfare, banditry and local raiding were pervasive threats. The breakdown of central authority, or simply the presence of desperate men, often meant that rural areas were preyed upon by armed gangs. These bandits targeted travelers on roads, but also small, isolated hamlets. Their aim was plunder, but resistance even from the elderly could be met with fatal force. An older person might be beaten or stabbed simply for hiding a meager coin or a loaf of bread. The famed outlaw figures like Robin Hood in English folklore arose from a reality where local lords or royal authorities often struggled to maintain peace, leaving common folk vulnerable. These raids also resulted in the destruction of property and the theft of food, mirroring the impact of larger military campaigns on older populations. The strictures of medieval justice also presented a direct and fatal threat to older individuals. While fewer older people might have been accused of violent crimes, they were not immune to accusations of theft, heresy, or witchcraft. The judicial system was often brutal, relying on torture to extract confessions and summary executions. Even if innocent, an older person's body would be less able to withstand the rigors of imprisonment, the lack of food, or the physical abuses of interrogation. A broken bone, an open wound, or a severe beating inflicted during questioning could easily become a terminal injury for an aged body. Public executions, by hanging, beheading, or burning, were common spectacles. While the condemned were rarely old, the sheer terror of witnessing such events or being accused could lead to fatal stress in those already frail. Accounts of the Spanish Inquisition later in the medieval period sometimes mention older individuals, often women, being subjected to trials and executions for perceived heresy or witchcraft, a horrifying end to a long life. Feuds between noble families or rival villages, though not on the scale of national wars, often resulted in localized violence that claimed innocent lives. A dispute over land or honor could escalate into armed clashes, where homes were burned and non-combatants were caught in the crossfire. An older farmer, working his fields near a disputed boundary, could be inadvertently killed in a skirmish between armed retinues. The loss of a family patriarch or matriarch, especially if they were the primary holders of land or knowledge, could devastate a family, plunging its surviving elderly members into even greater vulnerability. Moreover, the psychological toll of living in such an unstable and violent environment cannot be overstated. Chronic fear and stress, coupled with malnutrition and exposure, wore down the body's defenses. For an older person who might have lived through multiple periods of war, famine, and unrest, the cumulative anxiety could hasten their decline, making them more susceptible to any illness that came their way. A sudden shock, a terrifying encounter, or the witnessing of brutal acts could induce fatal heart failure in an already weakened individual. The medieval world, despite its periods of relative peace, always held the shadow of violence close, and for those nearing the end of their lives, that shadow could suddenly, definitively swallow them whole. Their advanced age offered no true sanctuary from the sharp edge of a sword, the crushing blow of a mace, or the slow, agonizing death brought on by the complete destruction of their familiar world. Number 3. Accidents and unintended injuries. Life in the medieval period was a daily dance with peril, and for older people, the consequences of a misstep or a moment of bad luck could be irreversible. Unlike the dramatic and widespread devastation of plagues or famines, death by accident was often a solitary, mundane, and yet equally final event. The very fabric of daily existence, from the tools they used to the structures they inhabited, posed constant, often invisible threats to those whose bodies were no longer as agile or resilient as they once were. Agriculture, the cornerstone of medieval society, was a particularly dangerous profession even for those who had retired from the heaviest labor. Older individuals might still be involved in lighter tasks, like gleaning, winnowing grain, or tending to small animals. Yet the tools of the trade were rudimentary and unforgiving. Scythes, sickles, and axes were sharp and could easily inflict deep wounds if a hand slipped or an old body faltered. A deep cut, even if not immediately fatal, was a significant problem in a world without antibiotics. Infection, often leading to gangrene or sepsis, was a common killer. A small cut on an older arm, perhaps from a rusty tool, could fester and spread slowly, claiming a life over days or weeks as the body's defenses struggled in vain. Haystacks, seemingly innocuous, could collapse, burying and suffocating someone who had climbed on them for storage. Even tasks like driving a cart or leading an ox could result in a fatal trampling. If an animal became spooked or an older person lost their footing. Mill accidents were also devastating. A person caught in the grinding gears or falling into the mill race could be crushed or drowned, a terrifying end to a working life. Domestic life, seemingly safer, held its own array of dangers. Medieval homes, often poorly lit and constructed, were rife with hazards. Uneven dirt floors, low doorways, and steep, unrailed staircases made falls common. For an older person with brittle bones, a fall could easily result in a broken hip or leg. Such an injury, while treatable today, was often a death sentence in the Middle Ages. The long period of immobility required for healing could lead to bed sores, pneumonia from lying in one position, or a general decline in health as the body struggled to recover. The absence of proper medical care meant that a simple fracture could result in agonizing pain and a prolonged, ultimately fatal illness. Open hearths, while providing warmth and a means for cooking, were a constant fire risk. A stray spark, a garment catching fire, or a simple misstep could lead to severe burns. For an older person, whose skin might be thinner and healing slower, extensive burns were almost always fatal, leading to shock, infection, or agonizing pain. Water sources, essential for survival, also presented risks. Fetching water from a well or a river was a daily chore. An older person, especially if vision was failing or if they carried a heavy bucket, could lose their balance and fall into a well or drown in a river. The icy cold of winter made these dangers even more acute. Accounts from parish records sometimes mention drownings, often with little detail beyond the tragic fact. Crossing a narrow, slippery plank bridge over a stream, a common feature in rural landscapes, could be treacherous. A misplaced step, particularly for someone with aching joints or poor eyesight, could plunge them into the water below, with drowning or hypothermia as the result. Beyond the home and farm, the broader medieval environment harbored dangers. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, prone to turning into quagmires in wet weather or becoming deeply rutted. Travel, even short distances, was difficult. An older person attempting a journey, perhaps to a market or to visit relatives, could be thrown from a horse or cart if it hit a rut, or slip and fall on a muddy path. Banditry was a separate category of violence, but accidental falls during a flight from bandits or injuries sustained while hiding could also be fatal. Bridges, often constructed simply from timber, could collapse, especially after heavy rains or floods, plunging anyone on them into rushing water. The construction of buildings, from cathedrals to cottages, was also hazardous. If an older person was involved in any capacity, even just assisting, they could be struck by falling masonry, timber, or tools. Accounts of accidents during the construction of major cathedrals sometimes mention workers falling from scaffolding with devastating consequences. Animals, both domesticated and wild, were another source of accidental injury. While farm animals were crucial for livelihood, they could be unpredictable. A kick from a horse, a goring by an ox, or a bite from an angry dog could inflict wounds that, for an older person, were impossible to recover from. Wild animals, driven by hunger or fear, occasionally attacked humans, while rare an encounter with a boar or a bear could result in fatal injuries, particularly for someone unable to defend themselves effectively. Even seemingly minor injuries, like an animal's scratch or bite, could introduce pathogens that led to severe infections, tetanus or rabies, all of which were incurable and often fatal for the elderly. The absence of safety regulations, modern medicine, and a general understanding of hygiene meant that almost any accidental injury, no matter how seemingly minor, carried a potential death sentence for an older medieval person. A broken bone, a deep cut, a severe burn, or a fall could trigger a cascade of complications, leading to a slow, painful demise from infection, pneumonia, or sheer bodily exhaustion. Their long lives, a testament to their previous resilience, often concluded with a moment of mundane misfortune that their aging bodies simply could not overcome. Number 2. Famine and malnutrition. The medieval world was fundamentally agrarian, and its people lived in a delicate balance with the land. When that balance was disrupted, particularly for older individuals, the consequences were devastating. Famine and chronic malnutrition were not merely periods of hunger. They were prolonged, agonizing killers that systematically stripped the body of its defenses, leaving it vulnerable to every conceivable ailment. For older medieval people, those whose bodies were already worn by decades of labor and a lifetime of often meager diets, a significant crop failure or a sustained period of scarcity was often the ultimate, inescapable doom. The most dramatic form of this killer was outright famine, brought on by successive bad harvests, prolonged droughts, excessive rains, or devastating pests like locusts. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which gripped much of northern Europe, stands as a stark example. Contemporary chronicles, like those of the Annals of Ghent, describe an apocalyptic scenario: continuous rains, rotting crops in the fields, widespread livestock disease, and an almost complete failure of the grain harvest for several years. Food prices skyrocketed, putting even basic sustenance out of reach for the majority of the population. For older people, who often lived on fixed small plots of land or were dependent on their younger kin, this meant immediate and desperate hunger. Their bodies, with less muscle mass and fewer fat reserves, succumbed to starvation much more quickly than those of the young and strong. As bodies wasted away, they would suffer from edema, their limbs swelling with fluid, or extreme emaciation, their skin stretched tight over bone. The mental faculties would dull, and profound lethargy would set in, making even the simplest movements an effort. Beyond direct starvation, the pervasive malnutrition of famine periods wreaked havoc on the immune system. A starving person, especially an older one, had no defenses against opportunistic infections. Diseases that might have been fought off in healthier times became lethal. Dysentery, often called the flux, became rampant as people resorted to eating spoiled food or contaminated water, leading to severe dehydration and death. The English chronicler Henry Knighton noted how the Great Famine was followed by outbreaks of pestilence, a clear indication of how weakened populations were susceptible to disease. For the elderly, whose immune systems were already naturally less robust, this meant that a common cold or a minor stomach upset could easily escalate into a fatal illness. A diet solely of gruel made from poor quality grain or wild plants scavenged from forests provided little to no essential vitamins or minerals, leading to deficiency diseases like scurvy or rickets, further debilitating the body and making it more prone to fatal complications. Even in good years, chronic malnutrition was a constant companion for many older medieval people. The typical peasant's diet consisted overwhelmingly of cereals, oats, barley, rye, or wheat made into bread or pottage. Meat was a rare luxury, and fresh vegetables and fruits were seasonal and often scarce, especially in winter. This monotonous diet, lacking in protein, iron, and a full spectrum of vitamins, led to a host of long-term health problems. Older individuals would have lived their entire lives on this barely sufficient fare, accumulating deficiencies. Anemia, a common condition, led to chronic fatigue and weakness, making them vulnerable to falls and injuries. Malnutrition also contributed to bone density, loss, and weakened muscles, making them more susceptible to fractures from even minor accidents. The economic reality of medieval society meant that older people were often the first to suffer when resources became scarce. They might have less physical strength to compete for work or food, and some might have been seen as less productive members of the household, leading to a subtle but significant reduction in their share of meager rations. Their reliance on younger family members or the charity of the church meant that their survival was precarious if the household itself struggled. The breakdown of social order during severe famines meant that communal support systems often collapsed, leaving the most vulnerable, including the elderly, to fend for themselves. The process of dying from starvation or malnutrition was often protracted and agonizing. It involved not just the absence of food, but a slow decay of all bodily functions. Muscle wasting, organ failure, extreme weakness, and profound apathy would characterize the final stages. The mind, too, would be affected, leading to confusion and delirium. For an older person, who might have already been suffering from age-related ailments, this compounded suffering was unbearable. Their deaths, though not always as sudden as plague, were often a drawn-out struggle against the body's complete collapse, a silent testament to the unforgiving nature of medieval subsistence. The records of monastic obituaries sometimes note an increase in deaths of older members during known famine years, often attributed simply to natural causes or infirmity, but understood to be the direct result of widespread hunger. Their long journey through life often ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless gnawing of an empty belly. Number 1. Infectious diseases. The medieval world was a microbial battleground, and for older people, those who had already accumulated decades of life's wear and tear, infectious diseases were the single most formidable and inescapable cause of death. Their bodies, often weakened by previous illnesses, chronic malnutrition, and a lifetime of harsh conditions, were simply less able to mount an effective defense against the relentless onslaught of pathogens that permeated every aspect of medieval existence. Unlike the sudden violence of battle or the slow agony of starvation, disease could strike swiftly or linger for years. But its outcome for the elderly was often tragically predictable. The most infamous killer was, of course, the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. While it spared no age group, older individuals were particularly vulnerable to the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic forms of the plague. The bubonic plague, characterized by swollen, painful lymph nodes, or buboes, fevers, and internal bleeding, overwhelmed the body's systems rapidly. For an older person, their weakened immune system, often compromised by poor diet and previous infections like tuberculosis, offered little resistance. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and spread through airborne droplets, was particularly devastating, causing agonizing shortness of breath and coughing, leading to swift demise. The septicemic plague, which directly infected the bloodstream, caused rapid internal bleeding and organ failure. Chroniclers like Gabriele de Mussi described the horror of the plague's onset and its indiscriminate reach, with older individuals often among the first to succumb due to their frailty. Even if they survived the initial wave, the long-term impact on their health and the societal breakdown caused by the plague meant a shortened lifespan, leaving them susceptible to recurrent outbreaks. Beyond the specter of the Black Death, endemic diseases were a constant threat that often carried off older people. Dysentery, frequently called the flux, was rampant due to contaminated water sources, lack of sanitation, and spoiled food. Symptoms included severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and fever. For an older person, the rapid dehydration and loss of electrolytes could quickly lead to kidney failure and death. Chronic cases of dysentery could also wear down the body over months, leaving the individual vulnerable to other infections. The English chronicler Matthew Paris, in the 13th century, often referred to widespread outbreaks of bloody flux, following periods of heavy rain or famine, noting its particular toll on the infirm and aged. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was another insidious killer. It often lingered for years, slowly eating away at the lungs and other organs, causing persistent cough, fever, weight loss, and weakness. For older individuals who might have been exposed repeatedly throughout their lives, a latent infection could reactivate, or a new infection could take hold, accelerating their decline. The slow, wasting nature of the disease meant that older people often suffered prolonged periods of debilitating illness before finally succumbing. Their bodies, unable to regenerate tissue effectively, were defenseless against the relentless bacterial assault. Chroniclers sometimes described individuals wasting away with a cough, a common medieval description for tuberculosis. Smallpox was a highly contagious and often fatal disease that left survivors scarred and sometimes blind. While children were often the primary victims, older individuals who had not previously been exposed or whose immunity had waned were still at risk. The high fever, widespread rash, and systemic infection could overwhelm an older body, leading to organ failure or fatal secondary infections. Even if they survived, the debilitating effects of the disease, including blindness or disfigurement, could make their remaining years even harder, contributing to a shorter overall lifespan. Fevers, broadly defined in medieval medicine as any elevated body temperature, were a catch-all for a multitude of illnesses that modern medicine can now distinguish. These fevers encompassed everything from influenza to typhoid, malaria, and undiagnosed bacterial infections. For an older person, even a seemingly common fever could quickly become life-threatening. Their bodies had less reserve to fight off systemic infection, and the high temperatures could trigger heart problems or neurological complications. Medieval medical texts, like the Breviary of Practice by Bernard of Gordon, often described different types of fevers and their symptoms, though effective treatments were scarce. Bloodletting, a common cure, often weakened the patient further, especially an older one already struggling. Herbal remedies offered little true antiviral or antibacterial effect, and prayers, while offering comfort, could not combat the microbial invasion. The living conditions of older medieval people exacerbated their vulnerability to disease. Overcrowded and unsanitary towns where human and animal waste often accumulated in streets and courtyards provided ideal breeding grounds for pathogens. Even in rural areas, poor personal hygiene, contaminated water sources, and close living quarters contributed to the easy spread of infection. The lack of understanding about germ theory meant that common practices like sharing eating utensils or beds when ill actively promoted disease transmission. Furthermore, the limited access to nourishing food meant that many older people were in a constant state of mild to severe malnutrition, which severely compromised their immune systems, leaving them susceptible to every cough, every cut, and every new wave of sickness. Their bodies, having endured so much, often simply yielded to the microscopic invaders they could neither see nor comprehend.